What is used to connect Unity to the database? Nerd magic. I don't know Zarkin in detail. Sorry. You guys may realize at some point, I am actually not a very technical person. Just because I've been hanging out with people that are very smart for the bulk of my adult life. Like half my life now has been spent making video games. I honestly, I don't know the correct answer to that. Nerd Magic would have been a good company name. That will be our umbrella. Nerd Magic LLC. That'll be one of our shell companies, Zukin. Write that down. Don't let the IRS know. Nerd Magic terrifies you as a concept. Too often I get called in as the security team and it's like written in VBA as an Excel macro for a critical company process. When people say things like that. Dozakar, I've talked to Ali. I like to sit in and watch some of the nerd conversations. And trust me, there are some very wild, interesting nerd conversations going on, right? We've got some really cool friends in the community that help us out with some stuff. There's always something interesting going on. I appreciate it. I say nerd magic in a loving way. But I say nerd magic because it is not my responsibility to know how that works. One of the things I learned quickly once I became a producer in 2011, I knew it before I became a producer. It's why I became a producer. The biggest part of my job is to ensure that the team has the right people. That's a huge part of being a producer. I mean, depending on how you define producer at your company or whatever. I would say anybody aspiring to be a producer, though, you will need to know enough to know whether or not the guys that you have doing different things are in the right ballpark. What is typically the relationship between a producer and an art director, Zukin asked? I guess when it comes to decision making, like I guess the producer is more running business things then, so art director. Yeah. Typically. So first of all, anything I say with regards to team structure or the definition of roles will ultimately not be 100% valid because every team can potentially do something differently. And so the definition of producer changes team to team, and their ultimate sort of responsibilities will change team to team. And it, a lot of times though, it's kind of a question of does the team have producers and then like a senior producer, executive producers? There are teams that are big enough that will maybe have an entire cadre of different producers. But ultimately, if you're looking at producer as the person who's ultimately responsible for the project, in most cases, I think it's fair to say that the various directors will report up through the producer. At my last company, they actually had all of tech reporting up through CTO, right? You would have basic tech had its own hierarchy, which ran parallel to production. And under the producer, you basically had everybody else, art and design, etc. Right? So it comes down to how your company's structured. But in most cases, you're going to have a project. That project is going to have at least one person that is the sort of central point of authority, and they are ultimately going to make the call. Now, could that producer then say, I'm going to override the art director on an art-related topic? In most cases, or at least I'd say in many cases, yes, because ultimately, the producer is responsible for the project. In the past, I've been, like when I was a senior producer on a team, that team all fell under me. There are support services and things like that, like customer service, which were not on the team, but even like community management was on the team. So the structure of that team ultimately was my decision, and I was responsible for the like full profit and loss sheet, right? So how I structured the team and then how I, ran the team was ultimately on me. But then if I ran the team in a way or structured the team in a way where the team all quit or we stopped getting shit done, we didn't deliver, we didn't hit our various goals, then ultimately I reported up to the CEO, and the CEO would wonder why I'm screwing things up, right? Because all of that ultimately comes down to sort of business terms, and it would trickle up to the CEO in that we are either missing our targets, we are missing our profitability per person, right? Because some teams are just looked at as what's your profitability per person. So, the difference between a 30-person team and a 50-person team, if they're generating the same revenue, would be viewed, right? There's an obvious difference there, right? And there may be certain metrics that when you come into the role that you're given, like you need to hit, 60% plus profitability per team member. And you need to generate X amount of revenue per quarter, per month. You need to generate X amount of profit, all that stuff. Now, in smaller studios, smaller teams, you may have a producer that's pretty hands-on. We don't do a lot of, like, we don't really have titles in our company, right? I think the closest thing we have to titles are, like, Zukin is the primary over characters, right? So ultimately, Zukin is the go-to person when it comes to characters, and as much as possible, and I want to say it that way because it's never 100% perfect, as Zukin would tell you, as much as possible, Zukin gets to make sort of the final decision on different topics, right? But there's always going to be a bit of sort of managing various stakeholders and trying to keep everybody as happy as possible, I think. Now, on a bigger team, you may have a producer and you may have a game director. And so then the producer is really much more about running the business, and the game director is more about ensuring that there's a solid vision to the game and that the that vision's being actualized. And then conflicts between those two will be typically resolved by somebody above them, right? Like in a scenario like that, I would have to imagine that there's then either a senior producer or an executive producer or a studio head that winds up being the person responsible for ultimately saying yes or no. I think Thunderdome structure would be fun. Producer is the promoter, referee. All disagreements are settled by champions. Each quarter, art director, content director, lead programmer battle determine priorities. I mean, it's kind of like that on some teams. It's not physical battle. Occasionally that gets called into question whether or not it should be, but the producer on EverQuest when I was there, after Brad and Butler and those guys left to start Sigil, the producer that took over, Robert Pfister, he was really like he just wanted the team to run properly. He wanted to make sure the business part of things was taken care of, that we hit our dates, things were scheduled, but he didn't give a shit about subject matter. He didn't have any preference on the subject matter at all. He didn't play EverQuest. And so the way he ran most things was he would, when a decision needed to be made, he would go, design nerd, art nerd, tech nerd, come here. You know, a lot of times for the design nerd part of it, since we're doing a lot of expansions, as the expansion lead / content lead, but whatever you want to call it, but as expansion lead, that would be me. You know, the actual design director, Rich, was often just trying to deal with keeping everything running, you know, live situation, class balance, everything else. And then I got to head up a lot of what was going on the design side with expansions. And so we would just all go in, or Rich would come in as well, or it would be sort of the directors and the leads, and we'd go into a meeting and then we'd argue it out. Before you guys got on the team, we actually spoke to an art director. There's a pretty experienced guy who a lot of his background was in kind of relevant subject matter. He'd worked on fantasy games in the past. They're very old school. You know, art style is not wildly different from what we've been shooting for, any of that. And so yeah, he is somebody I didn't know personally, but had worked at a company I worked at previously. He got recommended. So one of the first people we talked to outside of, like, you know, Nick, Ali, and I, and Bunny was on the team, but one of the first people we talked to was an art director. He had a very specific idea for what he wanted to do with the art direction. Like, we were like, hey, it'd be cool because then you'll, you know, like, you'd work with the three of us and we'd figure out the art, and this is what we'd like to see, and here's a bunch of ref, and here's what we've been talking about and all that stuff. And he started firing back some things that were not that. And we were like, nah, well, this isn't our style, and I just don't think it looks right. You know, I mean, Zukin, you've dealt with us, right? So we just gave the normal feedback that we always give. He was like, nah, but what about, you know, like, I'd rather do this. And we're like, nah, could you please change this exactly, you know, to be like this? And so within a span of like a few days of just working with this guy, he fired back like, I'm not a junior artist. I don't need you to tell me how to do art. And we were like, alrighty, I guess this isn't going to be the place for you, because we got a lot of thoughts. Zarkin said, to be fair, the artist guy was probably just jaded from having crappy coworkers tell him what to do. I once had a non-artist tell the artist that the shade of green we were using was incorrect, and we had to go back and correct everything. Meanwhile, he had two poorly calibrated monitors that showed two different greens, both of which displayed incorrectly. Yeah, I mean, it could be, but the thing is, why would we start a company just to basically give this guy that we don't know completely free reign on the visual direction of it? Like, makes zero sense. And the thing is, if you're super experienced, if you've been doing this for 15, 20, 25 years, and you're not aware of that, sort of not aware that that's probably going to be the case, then I would have concerns with working with somebody that kind of couldn't read the room like that, right? It is interesting how important personality of employees plays a huge part in the success of business. I think it's probably, I don't know. Does it seem like an overstatement if I said that personality of the employees and their ability to work together is 80% of whether or not the business is going to be successful, especially in game development? It might be a overstatement. I don't know. Huge for sure. True of most software environments. That goes for any workspace. A bunch of cool people makes everything better. Needs to be a good cultural fit. Darius says the more assholes at work, the more problems. Shogun says 40% skill as an artist, 60% communication as an employed artist. Got to mesh and communicate well. It's not like this isn't rocket surgery. We're not, there are, not to understate the technical challenges of what we're doing, to dismiss the value of the creativity that our artists bring in or anything like that. But the hardest part of getting it done is getting people to communicate well with each other, be patient with each other, be patient with the process, feel safe. There's a great book on this topic. If you've never read it, it's worth a read, even if you don't enact all of it. It's a book by Ed Catmull. It's got some fun history of 3D graphics and stuff in there as well. Ed Catmull is really kind of like an unsung hero of 3D graphic. Creativity Inc., overcoming the unseen forces that stand in the way of true inspiration. And a big part of what the book is about is how do you create an environment in which people feel safe? Right? Safe to provide feedback, safe to receive feedback. Because you could be in an environment where like somebody comes up, it could be, so check it out. The same poor feedback could have two completely different impacts based off of the culture of the team and like the environment. Someone could come up and give unproductive feedback like, hey, that thing looks like shit. Or, hey, that encounter, didn't have fun. It was lame, right? Like that's not helpful feedback. It's pretty rough. Like oh shit, that looks like shit, or that's lame. Oh, right. That's tough feedback. Now, the thing is, if we're tight, like if we like each other, even if we like each other most of the time, and sometimes, man, we just really don't like each other, but it's kind of like that shit where you've got a best friend or you got a brother and you kind of need to box them in the ears a couple times, right? But like if we generally like and trust each other, someone's like, hey man, that was shit, you're like, oh damn, really? It was? All right, yeah, what didn't you like about it? Or like I kind of felt that going into it, or I wasn't, you know what I mean? Like you don't want to, everybody always wants to make good stuff, but so you don't want to hear, oh that was shit. But sometimes that could be like normal feedback, right? Where it's like, oh man, that sucked. Oh, all right. Yeah, I kind of felt that way too. No big deal. And yeah, right. You could get the feedback from like, you could get the feedback that it just looks like a worst ever quest. And you're like, all right, man, I kind of hear what you're saying because of blah and this. And I blame Steve Jobs for people saying stuff like that and thinking it's okay. But again, I'm telling you there's two different environments here. I don't blame Steve Jobs for it because listen, when I was in the army, we straight shit talked each other. We were horrible to each other. And it didn't mean anything. That's how we talked. And hey, I'm not saying every work environment needs to be this way. I'm using an extreme example, all right? Now, you could be in another environment where there's a lot of talking behind the scenes and there's a lot of cliques and it's very political, right? Like if it's just straight, hey, we just always say what we have to say very directly and we don't mean anything by it. And you know what? Like I can tell you, oh, that's pretty shitty, and give you a hug and be like, I know you're going to do better or whatever. That's one environment. And then the other environment is, hey, that's shit. And you know that that's probably the best thing the person's going to say about it, because then they're going to be like, hey, did you see this guy? I don't know that he needs to be on the team. Yeah, you know what? We keep giving him a break and then like keeps making this shitty stuff. And, like, man, maybe we need to think about like, should we start getting someone else to replace him? Blah, blah, blah. Right? And so one of the things that's in the book, in the Ed Catmull book, is these meetings that they'd have called the Brain Trust meetings, where the various directors for Pixar, because the book's basically about Pixar. So the various directors from Pixar and animators, like that, sort of the higher level folks would get together and like review a reel or a daily or something and give very, very direct feedback. And everybody knew that was a part of that, when they left that room, when they left that meeting, that was that. They gave the feedback. They're not going off and going like, oh man, did you see that shit? That guy, maybe he sucks or whatever. It was just like, hey, we're going to give you feedback. Please take it. Do something with it. Don't do something with it. Ultimately, you got to own your result. And it was like, how do you create an environment where people feel safe enough that, like, if you make a mistake, you don't think you're on a chopping block? I've been in environments that were so political that you, like, the ulcer is forming because it's every time any little thing was wrong, there's that feeling of, oh man, it's going on the list. I could get fired any day now, right? And that's just, it's a shitty environment. It's a shitty feeling, right? And a lot of times, I've seen that happen in kind of in this weird way where people are trying to be nice so they don't say like super negative stuff. Like Kenji just said, toxic positivity is also not the right environment. Where all of a sudden it's like, yeah, we're gonna try to give you the feedback as nice as possible in the meeting, right? Because we don't want to be rude, we don't want to be abrasive, we don't want to be toxic. But then those people that didn't give the feedback in a very direct manner would spend a fair amount of time like continuing the conversation afterwards. It's like, yeah, well, I'm not sure if she's the right person for the job, and it's like, oh, horrible, man. And to me, that's worse. I'd rather somebody be like, hey man, this is shitty, but I know you can do better, and then know that they're not, that's it, that's the feedback. They go off and they're not holding it against me. It's not a little tick mark on my did something wrong list or any of that stuff. So, I mean, I think within our team, I don't know. I mean, at the end of the day, like maybe we need an anonymous survey or something at some point. I think hopefully the team knows that we're direct at times and we go back and forth or, whatever, but we're not sitting there like taking your inventory constantly and going, well, I don't know. We have a lot of follow-up conversations and a lot of sort of like middle ground conversations when people aren't agreeing or whatever. And, I mean, we put time into it, but from my position up in the ivory tower at least, it seems like things feel pretty good or go well.